Dungeon World is a narrative-centric fantasy RPG written by Sage Latorra and Adam Koebel. It was published under the Burning Wheel imprint and has been reprinted a number of times with slight revisions since its first publication in 2012. The basic system behind Dungeon World is called the Powered by the Apocalypse engine and is based on 2 six-sided dice and a narrative style of play. I have a lot of positive things to say about Dungeon World, but it bears mentioning the problems with this book. First, it's about 407 pages, which is understandable from the point of it being a completely standalone role-playing game. It contains everything from the system to character creation to world building and an entire menagerie of 136 monster descriptions. But between the conversational tone and that monster section, the book is ironically long for anyone seeking a rules-light system. There are also countless quotes from pop culture that are related to a paragraph, but don't really have any substantive bearing on the material. That being said, Dungeon World is a bit of a ground-shaking achievement. Here is what it is asking you to do. 1. Use 2d6. The system boils down to 2 six-sided dice. When you make a so-called move, you roll 2 dice, and then you add your modifier. 6 or less is a failure, in which the GM makes their hard move. If you roll a 7, 8, or 9, you earn a sort of Pyrrhic success, or a success with a cost, and a 10 through 12 is an unqualified success. In a sense, banishing the polyhedra allows the narrative to take center stage and move faster. 2. Use moves for everything. The fabric of Dungeon World is moves. The book contains 8 basic moves and 13 special moves, but those are just the beginning. Once you have chosen a class, there are 8 standard fantasy classes, you have 3 or 4 starting moves. And as you level that character up, you can choose from 20 class-specific advanced moves for that character. Moves at their core are composed of a trigger and an effect. The most common move for a fighter is hack and slash, or volley for someone using a ranged attack. The GM also has moves, 12 to be exact, but they are never announced or named at the table. When the situation calls for a GM to use a move, which is basically any time the moment is right, or when a player rolls a 6 or less, the GM weaves one of these moves into the narrative or fiction. 3. Keep the narrative moving. One of the most jarring and interesting notions of Dungeon World is that it emphasizes the narrative between the players and GM, heavily emphasizes. The story being told is what drives the session. There are still classes and levels and XP and gear and weapons and enemies and adventure plots, but the game doesn't care about how the characters plod through the world as much as what the consequences of their actions are. So for example, if 3 PCs encounter 3 monsters, initiative is not rolled. There might be a loose turn order to be followed, but generally the players just say exactly what they are trying to do. The monsters don't necessarily take turns either. Instead, there is a battle of descriptions and simple dice rolls, and of cleverly placed moves, and of diabolical choices handed down by the GM. Even success rolls have a story to them. With regard to attributes and modifiers, despite the revolutionary notions in Dungeon World, its authors are still asking you to run down your standard attributes with a maximum of 18, and as those stats level up over time, the modifiers for them inch up as well. You level up by gaining experience points. You get XP by playing to your character, playing to your alignment, or by failing a roll. That's right, by rolling a 6 or less, you automatically get 1 XP. Once you have the number of XP equal to your current level, plus 1, you can use the level up move to level up. Leveling up gives you 1 advanced move for your class, 1 stat point to dump into one of your 6 attributes, and a spell if you're a wizard. If you max out at level 10, you can retire your hero, trade in all your moves associated with your class and start over in a new class, or have your character take on an apprentice when you play. This last notion of an apprentice is a very cool idea since it creates continuity with your characters and encourages a long view of your personal contributions to a table's narrative. It can't be overstated the importance of things like a bond statement on a character sheet. Dungeon World goes out of its way to make sure that each class has its own fill-in-the-blank statements. This makes it easy for the player to connect their character to the other characters at the table, and the bond statements are always being resolved or neutralized in some way, which earns the player more XP. Bond statements act as a heavy-duty grease on the roleplay wheels that get the session going and get the players thinking through their character's point of view. A lot of the number crunching has been systematically stripped away in Dungeon World in order to facilitate faster gameplay. For example, there is no armor class to assess whether a creature hits or not. An armor rating merely acts as extra hit points to absorb damage and can be repaired just as a character can be healed. And instead of weapons having their own damage numbers, they are described with tags. Damage is determined by class, the move being made, and the relevant modifier for that move. As I mentioned at the top of the video, a sizable portion of this book is dedicated to a bestiary. The irony of this section in particular is that it names about 136 creatures but has about 8 illustrations. Thus, if you want a visual understanding of many of the more esoteric creatures, you really need a D&D monster manual from virtually any era. The paragraph of text dedicated to each creature is written in a casual, sprawling style that doesn't always make use of the limited space allotted. Each creature description is more like a reminder to a seasoned GM of what that creature is supposed to be. The info that is relevant to Dungeon World itself, tags, damage, HP, armor, and special abilities, could fit on 2 lines of text. But to be fair, adding this big block of monster descriptions does technically make this book a one-stop shop for game session building. At first blush, it would seem that pigeonholing everything into 2 dice and a couple hundred moves is oversimplifying an old classic, but the charm lies in the trinary outcome of the dice. Putting aside the unfortunate loss of your d20 for a moment, let's take a look at the 3 dice outcomes again. Success at 10 to 12. This doesn't actually mean an unqualified success in a lot of cases. The GM is still asked to present 2 or more good choices for the player, forcing them into making more forward narrative. Partial success, 7 through 9. The strange beauty of Dungeon World resides here, where the GM either looks up the outcome of a partial success on a pre-written move, or presents one on the fly. For Defy Danger, the partial success is, quote, you stumble, hesitate, or flinch. The GM will offer you a worse outcome, a hard bargain, or ugly choice. Again, the player is forced into contributing towards the ongoing story in that moment. And making hard decisions at the table is simply interesting. In the literature, the GM is offering a soft action when they set up a situation. A setup might be something like the dragon rearing back and drawing a huge chest full of air. Although a player will more or less get what they aimed for with a partial success, they will often pay for it with a soft action by the GM. One interesting thing that bears mentioning is that here, as well as everywhere else in the game, the GM never rolls dice, even for their own moves. They either have the players roll for them as needed, or just narrate a move. Failure at 6 or below. The failed player roll will always result in a hard action by the GM, one that materially harms a player or alters the environment in a direction not intended by the player. They earn 1 XP for a fail, but it is usually hard-earned. This 3-way outcome system might seem too simple at first blush, but it actually allows for more variety of play and wild possibilities in battle, negotiations, barter, and everything in between. The constant descriptions of everything happening large and small with no defined order keeps a story churning. And if a player can attempt anything they want, but with a 75% chance of facing a moderate to severe negative consequence to their action, at the very least, you will have cut back on the murder hoboism at your table. But for this kind of system to blossom, the players and especially the GM have to be imaginative, and the GM hopefully would come to the table with some experience running RPGs. I could be wrong about that, but that's my take on a system that asks for perpetual descriptions without the warm security blanket of math. As much as Dungeon World demands that a GM be clever with the presentation of choices and versed in the pantheon of moves in the book, the game is just as much easy for new players. It is precisely because of the lack of number crunching and the verbal nature of the game that allows new players to just sit at the table, create a character, and start a story. Take a look at the character sheets. Each character class has its own character sheet. These sheets contain a ton of class-specific information pre-printed for the player. The bond statement, the appearance, and even the basic and advanced moves are all there. Starting gear is also conveniently there for the player. So there you go, Dungeon World. The authors are very forthcoming about their sources of inspiration, which is pretty cool. Obviously, Gygax and Arneson's Dungeons and Dragons, some bits from Burning Wheel, obviously Apocalypse World, and some others. Although there are other rules-light RPGs that have come out more recently, like Index Card RPG by Runehammer Games, which retains the polyhedra and the GM roles and adds a boatload of other fun mechanics for fast play, Dungeon World is a must-read for game masters who want to up their game. Just the 18-page GM section of the book alone is worth the price of admission here. But on that note, the entire book reads like a how-to on how to be a more engaging cinematic master of your game. The links to where to get this book in print or PDF are below. Let me know if you've had any experience with this game. Thanks for watching and listening and thinking with me. This is Dave signing off. See ya.